Sam Wilson here. Welcome to Sam's Antique Motors. Thought I'd take a minute today to just do a short video on putting together the steering column for a 55 to 59, maybe even earlier, maybe even later years. There's a lot of discussion about these things being worn out and how do I fix them, and they're just really a simple gear. And in my opinion, you'd have to put a lot of miles to wear one of these things out. So in this case, I tore this thing down. This came off of a donor truck out in Alabama. Steve McDonald provided for me and got the motor out of it. And in the truck I'm restoring, the previous owner cut the bottom off the column to make it a power steering gear, which I see no reason to do. The wheel is probably 17, 18 inches in diameter. The truck turns easily enough, even with a heavy load on it. So there's no reason to put power steering on a truck like this. But so I went and fished the gearbox, and it was a crusty, really mess of a gearbox off this truck, but it was all there, and it was locked up. But I took it apart, and I've now got everything cleaned up on it, and I was just going to kind of walk you through some of the pieces here and then putting it back together. So here we are, gearbox is cleaned up. Sandblasted everything, primed it with DP90. This is going in a 56 GMC, and the interior on this was Harmony Gray. So I taped off and coated the shaft as Harmony Gray. Then I got all the pieces here. This is the end cap, and this is how you adjust the end play on the steering shaft, which I also cleaned up. And this is the adjustment for that end cap with its locking ring. This is the nut and washer for the steering sector arm. We got two, I think these are called barrel bearings. You notice that, let's see if I can get this in focus. You notice these things have just a slight curve on the barrel. And there's a little bit of pitting on these, but not enough to really be concerned about given the amount of wear and rotation. And then this is the, get the focus in on this. This is the sector, and it's got just a little bit of wear on it, but not near enough to make any kind of difference in the steering. So on this casing, I can show you here. On this casing, I pressed out the inside bushing, and I found a new bushing and a new seal, and I pressed a new seal in there, and then it was just a little bit tight on this shaft, so I put this in a lathe, and I actually just polished it. I used an emery cloth and a light file and just polished it to where it sits in there nicely like it's supposed to. And then I did the same thing on this bushing, and actually this is the bushing that it was slightly tight on. This one has to be, this one is just pressed out. No, this one is just pressed out. This one I had to use a blind seal puller to pull it out, but I got new bushings and those all fit in there nice and tight. This is the sector shaft in play bolt. So it goes in here, and this has to actually be threaded into this when you install it. I'll show you here later. I got two gaskets that I made. I haven't found any source for gaskets, so I used some 10 thousandths gasket material and just made those. And then this is the worm gear, and again, this just has, just almost no wear. You can see where it's kind of polished, a little bit different texture, but there's no wear on this. So these people that say these things are worn out, I'd like to see one, because it's hard for me to imagine there being enough turn mechanism on one of these. This truck, I think, had about 120,000 miles on it. It was an original truck. And I'm quite confident the steering gear has never been out of it, so it's just in really good shape. And then these are the little balls that ride inside this, and I'll show you in a minute how that works, but there's 60 of those balls. So you got to feed those balls back into the gear, which is a little bit tricky, but that's how it works. So at this point, I've got everything ready, everything cleaned up, everything ready for reassembly, and now we're just going to go back and put it back together. All right, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put some grease in this little bearing. You know, we're going to put a heavy gear lube in here, and what I use is actually what they use on a Model A, which is a 600 weight steering gear lube, and that gives it really less of a chance of leaking is the main thing. But since this is up there in this little bearing race, I'm going to go ahead and kind of pack this as much as I can here. Just, if nothing else, for assembly, it'll help get it set up properly with the preload up on the inside. So this thing sits up in this bearing race. I don't know if you can see that or not, but it goes way up in there in that housing. So that's kind of the first thing to do. And then we're going to feed the steering shaft up through there. And the one thing I forgot to show is this is the horn bushing and the upper steering bearing. So this is really just a rubber press fit up in the end of this. I'm going to just kind of put it in there temporary for right now. I've already led the horn wire through there. So now I'm going to take this bearing and I'm going to grease this bearing up as well. This is again this barrel type bearing, which is unavailable. So if you take one of these apart, as far as I know, they're unavailable. I found these in the wheel bearings also in the 59 Napco. I was able to replace the race and the bearings in that case because they were in pretty bad shape. But these barrel roller bearings are not available, at least new. You might can find them new old stock, but I'm going to go ahead and put a little sealant on this, maybe. Yeah, that should, not with that one. Okay, I put some gasket maker on this gasket both sides, and then what you want to do is thread this in onto this shaft. What to do is to thread this gear block onto this spool, and we'll put the balls in later. But you want to make sure when you put this in that the sector will slide down in these teeth, because if you put it in backwards, the sector won't go in. So it has to feed in there like this in order for this to go on there. So you will just want to push this in like this. Like I say, we'll get the balls in there in just a second. All right, now I'm going to load. So we got the shaft in. I've got this block put on here, and you got to make sure when you put this in that it's going in the right direction, because if you don't, the sector gear won't go on. So when it goes in, these pieces, there's a thick side and a thin side, and you want the thin side to the top, so when this gear slides in, it'll mate to it. So very important if you don't want to take it back apart more than once. And so now I'm going to put these little bearings in here, And these little U-shaped housings are all the same. They're exactly the same, but they're different they have different cuts. So this has a little cut on it, and this is smooth. So when these mate together, they go in this hole in a certain pattern. So, and I took the bearings and I split them out into 2 piles, 30 each. And then I put a little grease in here, really just to hold these bearings in place. And I think I can get 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I think I can get, well, I can get at least 8. So when this, bearing half comes on there, there's a little tick right there, and this is where the ball goes back up in that slot. So you have to kind of pay attention. I took some photographs when I took it apart just to make sure that I could get it back in the same location that it went together with. So now the trick is to feed these little bearings down in there. And you have to kind of rotate it. Kind of rotate them around, and they'll eventually work down in these grooves. Okay, I got all 60 bearings back in there. Got that put in there the way it's supposed to be. Now we're going to push this back up in here. It's seated in the front race. That looks good. I put gasket sealer around this, and this is offset, so you have to make sure the high side goes to the top of the gear. And you want to make sure this is backed out so it doesn't put pressure on that bearing before you get ready to set the preload on it. These are 3/8 16 bolts, so they can take a fair amount of torque. But when you get them there, they hit bottom. So, okay. So now we got this set up, and what I'm going to do now is just set the preload. That you can see the shaft goes in and out about 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to just keep tightening this up until I get all of the free play out of it. Like that. And then once I get that sort of where it's got a little bit of resistance and there's no end play with the shaft, then I'm going to put this locking ring back on there. And there is a double side of this. It's kind of concave, so okay. Like that. Yep. And I read the service manual at one point on this, on how to do this some time ago. Actually, I did it when I was trying to clip it for someone else that had this question. And it says very important that you set this free play first, even if it's in the car, and then adjust this free play. So we got that all set up like we want it. Now what we're going to do is drop this in, and I'm again going to just put a little lube on here. This is really just for the assembly part. We're going to put lube in it, but might as well have a little grease on these pieces. Something else I learned on the last one of these that I built, is when I built it, I didn't really pay attention to where the gear was, this block, and where the pitman arm was. So I'm going to try to be a little smarter this time, and I'm going to thread this thing all the way to the end. Okay, so we're at the end, and I'm going to mark this just so I have a reference point. And I'm going to take it all the way to the other end. So that's 1 turn, 2 turns, 3 turns, 4 turns, 5 turns, and a half, a little more than a half. So I'm going to back this up to about where that would be and do 2.5 turns. So that's 1, 2.5. So that centers this block, and that looks just about exactly right. That centers this block in there. And now I'm going to drop this gear down in there through the shaft. I've got the new seal, I got the new bushings, and I got this thing where it's right in the middle. And we put it in like that. Like I say, before, when I did that, I had this block one way or the other, and then when I got ready to put the arm on, the arm was crooked. And when I turned the steering wheel, it locked out at about 1 turn and had 3 turns this way. So you want to center that up before you go putting all that stuff together. And now we want to put this piece on, and this is the only other tricky part, especially when you're taking it apart, because you don't know why this piece won't just come off of there. But there's this little, it's got a convex head on it, and it sits in here, and then you got to put this piece on the top of it, and once it goes in there, you got to thread this up onto that piece, because that's how you set the in and out on the preload of that sector. So now I'm going to put a little, again, some gasket material on this, just because I like to have a little on there, and so that grease doesn't come out. Doesn't have to be very much, but I'm going to put some on it. Okay, so now we got this in here. I think this is when you got to get this in there and start threading that. So again, this is the tricky part. This is where you really got to thread this thing in, and it's really tricky when you're taking it apart, because you don't expect to have to back that thing out in order to get it off of this shaft. So if you know that, you're halfway there. I'm actually pushing this back out a little bit so that I can get the gasket lined up right. And these bolt holes do go through the casing, so I think it's advisable to take these and put some thread sealant on them. I like using this Loctite 545. It's kind of expensive, but seems to do a pretty good job. Okay, so now I got that set up. Now what we want to do is set the preload on this. So we put this back in. And this is where you just want to get this set where there's still just a little bit in there. So I'm just pushing this in till we get a little bit of resistance and no free play. So this is really where you can get the adjustment on this. Even in the car, set this first, and then set this. So if you got extra wobble in the wheel, this is where you take that out. And I probably don't have a big enough wrench for that. So I'm gonna go get one off the wall. All right, so I got that done. Put the nut back over here. I pulled this nut off and got it parkerized, ready to go. So the pitman arm will go in there when we're ready. And I think that has it. So there you go. Fairly simple rebuild. I'll wipe all the fingerprints off, make sure all the bolts are torqued up, and this is ready to go. Hope you enjoyed the little tech session. If you did, feel free to leave comments and subscribe. Thank you very much.
Download the Restorat app today to begin managing, tracking, and documenting your restoration project.